The courtroom reeked of incense and judgment. Towering figures of the Zalari High Tribunal loomed above, their iridescent robes shifting like liquid metal under the artificial lights. At the center of it all, I stood on a raised platform, unarmed, outnumbered, and very much unwelcome. The sentence had already been decided before I even opened my mouth. "The punishment is set," intoned the chief arbiter, his voice like grinding stone. "For disrupting the sacred rite of continuance, you shall be shackled to Zalari warrior caste member Zalari then Verash for 1 cycle of the moons." The murmurs of the assembled crowd rolled like distant thunder. I swallowed the instinct to argue, knowing it would only worsen things. The rite of continuance, whatever it was, clearly held enormous weight, and somehow I had trampled all over it. "Bring forth the binding." A pair of enforcers stepped forward, one gripping a thick metallic cuff pulsing with faint blue energy. The other held an identical restraint. My supposed co-defendant was forced onto the platform beside me, her silver eyes burning with fury. Zalari then Verash stood taller than me, her posture rigid, every muscle taut as though resisting the very air around her. Her deep violet skin darkened with rage. "This is an insult," she spat, each word clipped and precise. "You shackle me to this creature as though I am some criminal?" Her outrage was met with indifference. The first cuff snapped around my wrist, the cold metal humming against my skin. The second latched onto her, and as soon as the circuit completed, a surge of energy bolted through the bond. It wasn't painful, but it left an undeniable weight, a constant presence, a reminder that we were no longer separate entities. "Your movements will be limited to a precise distance," the arbiter continued, as if we were nothing more than objects to be discussed. "Attempts to break the bond will result in escalation of containment measures. You will live, eat, and sleep together until the cycle concludes." I barely had time to process that before the enforcers wrenched us off the platform, guiding, no forcing, us forward as the tribunal chamber echoed with murmurs of finality. The heavy doors groaned shut behind us, sealing my fate. Zalari then yanked hard against the shackle, nearly dragging me off my feet. "You did this," she hissed, her voice a razor's edge. I caught my balance, gritting my teeth. "I don't even know what I did." "Your ignorance is no excuse. You mocked a sacred rite. I should be preparing for battle, not shackled to a reckless off-worlder." We emerged onto the streets of the capital, a sprawling labyrinth of luminous spires and gravity-defying bridges. Eyes followed us, some curious, others amused, and a few outright disgusted. Zalari society was rigid, built on hierarchy, tradition, and strength. Being bound to me, a human, a foreigner, was more than an inconvenience for her. It was humiliation. "Look, I'm not thrilled about this either," I said, attempting reason. "But since we're stuck, maybe we can figure out how to make it work without." She lunged forward. The shackles snapped taut, yanking me along with her. I stumbled, barely managing to avoid face-planting into the metallic pavement. She exhaled sharply. "This is intolerable." "Yeah, well, you're not exactly easy to get along with either," I shot back, rubbing my wrist. We made our way, awkwardly, to what I assumed were our assigned quarters, a modest dwelling embedded into the city's crystalline architecture. The entrance recognized her biometrics, sliding open with a soft chime. Inside, the space was minimal but efficient. A communal living area, a small food prep station, and 2 beds, far too close together for comfort. Zalari then surveyed the room with a scowl before turning to me. "You will take the floor." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not happening." Her hands curled into fists, and for a moment, I wondered if she'd actually try to knock me unconscious. Instead, she exhaled sharply through her nose, as though forcing herself into reluctant restraint. "Fine. First battle, a draw." We attempted dinner next, which was its own brand of disaster. The shackle's limited range meant that if I sat at the table, she had to be right there too. If she reached for something, I had to adjust. The process turned into an unspoken contest of who would yield first. Silence stretched between us, thick with unresolved fury. Eventually, she gave up, tossing her plate aside before stalking toward the sleeping area. I heard fabric rustling, the unmistakable sound of her settling onto the bed. "Do not wake me," she muttered, as though the very idea of existing in the same space as me was an unbearable burden. I stared at the ceiling for a long while before sleep finally took me. The next morning was worse. The first realization came when I sat up too quickly, forgetting that movement affected both of us. The resulting pull wrenched Zalari then out of her own rest, and before I could apologize she had me pinned to the wall, her forearm pressing hard against my throat. "Warn me next time," she growled, releasing me with a shove. I coughed, rubbing my neck. "Noted." Everything was a struggle. Walking through the city was a painful dance of mismatched strides. She walked with precise purpose, expecting me to anticipate every step. When I didn't, the shackle jerked uncomfortably, forcing constant adjustments. "Your movements are inefficient," she observed, irritation dripping from every syllable. "Sorry, my entire species wasn't bred for military-grade synchronization," I replied dryly. Her eyes narrowed. "You mock me again?" I sighed. "No. I'm just adjusting." Her expression remained unreadable, but she didn't press the matter further. We continued in uneasy silence until, in the distance, I caught sight of something. A group of heavily armored figures watching us from the shadows of a nearby alley. Their postures were tense, predatory. They weren't just curious onlookers. I didn't know much about Zalari customs, but even I understood one thing. Trouble was coming. The moment I noticed them, Zalari then had already reached the same conclusion. Her body tensed beside me, the barely perceptible shift in her stance signaling readiness for a fight. The armored figures in the alley weren't just loitering, they were watching us, calculating. I barely had time to open my mouth before they moved. A blur of motion. The first assailant lunged, something sharp glinting in his grip. Zalari then twisted, yanking me sideways with the shackle, and the blade cut through the space where I'd just been standing. The second attacker aimed for my ribs, but I staggered back. More from being dragged by my unwilling partner than any personal reflexes. Zalari then didn't hesitate. She met the third attacker with a vicious elbow to the jaw, the impact cracking like a snapped branch. He stumbled, but she didn't stop there. Using the momentum of the shackle, she pivoted, forcing me into an awkward turn with her as she slammed a knee into his stomach. I, on the other hand, was trying not to fall flat on my face. "Keep up, human," she snapped, barely sparing me a glance before she ducked beneath another strike. "Not exactly easy when I'm being flung around like a training dummy." I shot back, dodging a wild swing. The fourth attacker, clearly realizing I was the weak link, made a move directly toward me. He was fast, faster than I could react, but Zalari then was faster. The shackle tugged again as she turned sharply, my body yanked into motion as she intercepted the strike. She caught his wrist, twisted, and drove him into the ground with brutal efficiency. One of the remaining attackers hesitated. Then, as quickly as it started, they broke away, melting back into the alley, vanishing into the crowd beyond. I stood there, breathing hard, my pulse hammering. Zalari then remained still for a moment before releasing a slow breath. "Pathetic," she muttered, shaking off the confrontation like it was a minor inconvenience. I wiped sweat from my brow. "You're welcome, by the way." "For what?" "For being an excellent unintentional counterweight in your fight choreography." She huffed but didn't argue. Instead, she crouched, rifling through the pockets of the unconscious attacker at her feet. After a moment, she pulled out a small insignia etched into the metal plating of his armor. Her eyes darkened. "Who are they?" I asked. "Disgraced warriors. Mercenaries," she answered, slipping the insignia into her belt. "They do not act without incentive." "Which means someone sent them after us." She didn't respond, but the grim set of her jaw spoke volumes. Without another word, she turned and started walking, the shackle tugging me forward in the process. We didn't stop until we reached the outskirts of the city, a quieter district where the towering crystalline structures gave way to smaller, more functional dwellings. I exhaled, still feeling the phantom adrenaline in my veins. Zalari then leaned against a railing, inspecting the shackle with a pensive expression. For the first time since this ordeal began, she wasn't scowling at me. "You fought poorly," she finally said. I rolled my eyes. "You don't say. But you did not run." I blinked at that, caught off guard by what almost sounded like reluctant approval. "Wasn't exactly an option," I pointed out, lifting my shackled wrist. "Even without the restraint, you would not have fled." She didn't phrase it like a question. It was an observation, one she seemed to be weighing carefully. "Yeah, well," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. "Kind of hard to abandon someone when you're forcibly attached to them." A hint of something, amusement maybe, flickered in her expression before she pushed off the railing. You need training, she said simply. I blinked. Come again. If we are to survive another encounter like that, you must not be a liability. Wow. Flattering. Ignoring my sarcasm, she crossed the space between us in a few measured steps. You're slow. Uncoordinated. Weak. All right, you can stop listing my flaws at any time. She pressed 2 fingers against my sternum, and with the slightest shift of pressure, I nearly lost my balance. Unacceptable, she stated. I sighed. So what, you're gonna make me your personal training project? It benefits us both. I wanted to argue, but she had a point. I wasn't built for Zalari combat, but I sure as hell wasn't interested in being dead weight. Fine, I relented. But don't expect miracles. Zalari then didn't smile, she never smiled, but I could tell she was at least mildly satisfied with my answer. Over the next several days our routine changed. The forced proximity no longer felt like a constant battle for space but an uneasy truce. She drilled me in footwork, reaction speed, and counterbalance techniques that made our tethered existence slightly less miserable. I still wasn't anywhere near her level, but I stopped tripping over my own feet every time she moved. Little by little something shifted. The silence between us no longer bristled with hostility but settled into something else. Something not quite comfortable but not entirely unpleasant either. One evening, as we sat across from each other after a particularly brutal training session, she studied me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. You said you did not know why you were sentenced, she said. I shook my head. No clue. One minute I was trying to avoid offending anyone, the next I was standing trial. She was quiet for a moment before exhaling. The right of continuance is sacred. To interrupt it is a grave offense. I didn't even know I was interrupting anything. She hesitated, then almost grudgingly said, perhaps that is true. It was the closest thing to an admission that I might not be entirely to blame. Progress. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. So, what happens when this whole punishment ends? We just go our separate ways. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was unreadable. Perhaps. Neither of us said anything after that, but the unspoken weight of the conversation lingered between us. And for the first time since this mess began, I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about that. The night was unnervingly still. No distant hum of passing patrols, no faint murmurs of the city's nocturnal life. Just silence. A kind that pressed in too tightly, making the space around us feel smaller than it was. Zalari then felt it too. She stood near the entrance of our quarters, head tilted slightly, every muscle drawn taut. Her warrior instincts didn't allow for idle paranoia. If she was tense, it was because something was coming. I sat up, shifting my weight carefully, mindful of the shackle's ever-present tug between us. You hear something? She didn't answer immediately, only raised a hand. Wait. A heartbeat later, the lights flickered. A pulse of energy ran through the walls, disrupting the crystalline structure of the room, warping shadows where there should have been none. Then the attack came. The ceiling imploded in a cascade of jagged shards. A dark shape dropped through the breach, moving with fluid precision. Not just another mercenary. Something else. Something faster. Zalari then was already in motion, dragging me into a roll as the impact sent shockwaves through the floor. The moment we regained our footing, the assassin struck. I barely saw it, just the flicker of motion before Zalari then caught the attacker's wrist, twisting sharply. A blade clattered to the ground, skidding toward me. My fingers closed around the hilt before my mind caught up to the fact that I'd just armed myself. The assassin, smaller than the mercenaries but far more dangerous, didn't hesitate. They pivoted, breaking free with inhuman agility, striking again. Zalari then met each attack, blocking, countering, but the confined space worked against her. Against us. Another flicker. The assassin wasn't alone. A second figure emerged from the shadows, darting toward me. I reacted before thinking, the training drilled into me over the past few days kicking in. I sidestepped the lunge, bringing the stolen blade up in a clumsy but desperate arc. It wasn't pretty, but it forced them back. A sharp yank on the shackle nearly dislocated my shoulder. Zalari then had shifted again, adjusting for another strike, and I had no choice but to move with her. The fight turned into a chaotic push and pull, every movement dictated by the unrelenting bond between us. And yet, we weren't completely out of sync. Zalari then adapted with a level of skill I could only envy, adjusting her stance to account for my reflexes, compensating for my slower reactions. And I, through sheer survival instinct, started mirroring her. My footwork followed hers. My weight shifted when hers did. For the first time, the shackle wasn't a hindrance. It was a weapon. The assassin realized it too late. Solari then caught their misstep, using the momentum of our tethered connection to whip around them. The movement dragged me along with her, but instead of resisting, I leaned into it, driving my stolen blade forward at the exact moment she struck from the other side. The assassin barely had time to react before both of our attacks landed simultaneously. They crumpled. The second figure hesitated. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished, slipping through the shattered ceiling and disappearing into the night. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same. This time it was heavier. Solari then exhaled, stepping back just enough to inspect the fallen attacker. Her expression remained unreadable, but the tension in her jaw spoke volumes. "They're not mercenaries," I said, my voice hoarse. "No," she agreed. "They are something worse." She crouched, turning over the insignia on the attacker's armor. It was different from the one she had found before. Sleeker, more refined. More official. She swore under her breath. I swallowed. "You know who they are." Her grip tightened around the insignia before she pocketed it. "I suspected. Now I am certain." I waited, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned to me, studying me in a way she never had before. There was no disdain. No irritation. Just a careful assessment, as though seeing me for the first time as something more than a burden. "You did not falter," she said finally. I let out a shaky breath, still gripping the blade. "Trust me, I wanted to. But you didn't." It wasn't praise. Not exactly. But coming from her, it might as well have been. I glanced at the still body between us, then back at her. "What now?" Her gaze flickered toward the open ceiling, the distant stars beyond it. Then to the shackle binding us together. "We find out who wants us dead." I nodded. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The streets were emptier than they should have been. Even at this hour, the city never truly slept. Yet as we moved through the winding corridors of the lower districts, a strange absence hung in the air. Fewer pedestrians. No patrols. It wasn't right. Solari then noticed it too. Her grip tightened slightly, her pace quickening. The shackle between us forced me to keep up, but I didn't complain. If she was on edge, I had every reason to be. "We're being funneled," she muttered. I frowned. "Funneled where?" She didn't answer, but her free hand drifted toward her blade, and that told me enough. Someone wanted us heading in a particular direction. The only question was whether we would play along or try to break the pattern. The decision was made for us a few moments later. A gate slammed shut behind us. I spun, instinctively tugging against the shackle, but Solari then had already turned forward again, her stance lowering. Figures emerged from the shadows, each one clad in the same sleek, refined armor as the assassins from before. This time, however, they didn't strike immediately. They stood in formation waiting. Then a single figure stepped forward. Unlike the others, this one didn't wear a mask. Their face was sharp, severe, with eyes that burned with an intensity that sent a chill through me. They carried no visible weapon, yet there was something about them that felt more dangerous than any blade. Solari then's entire body went rigid. I had never seen her hesitate before. "Not like this." "You," she said, her voice laced with something close to recognition. The figure offered a slow nod. "It has been some time, Solari then." I glanced between them, trying to piece together the sudden tension. "You know this guy?" She didn't answer me, but I didn't need one. The way her fingers twitched toward her weapon, the slight shift of her stance, it was all the confirmation I needed. The stranger's gaze flicked toward the shackle connecting us. "Interesting," he mused. "This is what they have done to you." Solari then's jaw tightened. "State your purpose." The man tilted his head slightly. "You already know why I am here." Something unspoken passed between them, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like an outsider to my own fate. Then without warning, the man moved. He didn't lunge. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply raised a hand, and the very air around us seemed to warp. Pain exploded along my wrist. The shackle burned, an unnatural heat surging through the metal, searing into my skin. I staggered, barely biting back a cry. Solari then gritted her teeth, her own arm jerking as she fought against whatever was happening. The man watched, unbothered. "This punishment was never meant to last," he said. "It was a lesson. One that has been taught." The pain intensified. My vision blurred, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. I barely registered Zalari, then stepping closer, placing herself between me and the man. "Enough," she snarled. The heat vanished. I gasped, stumbling slightly. Zalari-than's grip caught my arm before I could fall, steadying me. My wrist throbbed where the shackle had burned, but the metal itself was unchanged. No scorch marks. No sign of what had just happened. The man studied us for a long moment. Then almost idly he said, "It will break soon." Zalari then didn't react, but I felt the subtle way her fingers tensed against my arm. "Why?" she asked, voice low. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because you have already made your choice." With that he turned and walked away. The other armored figures followed without a word. Within moments they had disappeared, leaving only the distant hum of the city behind them. I exhaled slowly. "Okay," I managed. "What the hell was that?" Zalari then didn't answer immediately. She stared after the retreating figures, her expression unreadable. "Zell," I pressed, using the shortened version of her name without thinking. She blinked, finally looking at me. "The shackle," she murmured. "It is breaking." I frowned. "Isn't that good?" She didn't respond. Not with words. But something in her eyes made my stomach twist. For the first time since we had been bound together, she looked uncertain. And that terrified me more than anything else. The wind howled between the towering spires of the city, carrying with it the distant echoes of sirens and the hum of unseen drones. It was a reminder that we were still being watched, still being followed, no matter how many turns we took through the labyrinth of back alleys. Zalari then moved with a determined pace, her grip tight around my wrist. Not just because of the shackle, but because she refused to let me fall behind. I could still feel the lingering heat where the metal had burned me. The man's words played over in my mind, unsettling in their certainty. "It will break soon." What did that mean? What happened when the bond between us was severed? I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. Zalari then hadn't spoken since the encounter. Her silence felt heavier than usual, like a weight pressing against the space between us. It wasn't just caution or strategy. This was something else. Finally, I had enough. "You need to tell me what's going on." She didn't stop walking, but her shoulders tensed. "You already know." "No, I really don't." I yanked slightly on the shackle, forcing her to at least acknowledge me. "That guy, he knew you. He knew about the shackle. And whatever he did back there," I gestured at my wrist, "wasn't normal. So tell me, what the hell does he mean it's breaking?" For a moment I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then without slowing she said, "The bond was never meant to be permanent." I frowned. "Yeah, I got that part." She exhaled, but it wasn't frustration. It was something closer to reluctance. "The shackle is not just a restraint," she admitted. "It forces two individuals to synchronize. Over time your movements, instincts, and even your thoughts begin to align." That sent a chill down my spine. "Wait, what?" She finally stopped, turning to face me fully. "The more we fight, the more we survive together, the more we become connected." Her gaze flickered downward toward the shackle. "Until there is no longer a need for the bond at all." I stared at her. "You're saying it's rewiring us?" She nodded once. I swallowed hard, glancing at the shackle with renewed unease. "And when it breaks?" There was a long pause. "We will not be the same." That wasn't an answer, not really. But the way she said it, so controlled, so measured, made me realize she wasn't just talking about the physical consequences. Something deeper was happening. Before I could press further, a low hum vibrated through the air. Not from above but from beneath our feet. Zalari then reacted first, grabbing my arm and yanking me backward just as the ground beneath us exploded in a shower of debris. We hit the pavement hard. A second blast erupted from the side, forcing us to roll in tandem to avoid the collapsing structure beside us. Dust choked the air, and through the chaos I saw them. Another team of assassins emerging from the wreckage with weapons drawn. Zalari then didn't hesitate. She was already moving, dragging me into the fight before I could fully regain my bearings. The shackle forced me to keep up, but this time I wasn't just dead weight. I matched her steps, dodging when she dodged, countering when she struck. It should have been impossible. A week ago I would have been a liability. But now. I could feel her intentions before she moved. My body reacted not out of thought but out of instinct. One of the assassins lunged for me. Without hesitation I twisted with the shackle's momentum, letting Zalarithan's own motion guide my strike. My fist connected with the attacker's throat. They staggered. She finished them off a heartbeat later. The fight ended almost as quickly as it had begun. We stood there breathing hard, surrounded by fallen enemies. The city groaned around us, the aftermath of the explosions leaving everything on edge. I could feel my heart pounding, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. Zalarithan was staring at me. Not in irritation. Not in frustration. Something different. I realized with sudden clarity that the shackle didn't feel as heavy anymore. The pull between us wasn't as rigid. It was changing. So was I. He saw it too. A flicker of something unreadable passed across her face before she turned away. "We need to move," she said. But I wasn't sure if we were still running from the same things anymore. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal, the echoes of the skirmish still ringing through the hollow corridors of the Undercity. My pulse thundered in my ears, but not from exertion. Something had changed in that fight. Something fundamental. Zalarithan felt it too. I could see it in the way she moved, the slight hesitation before she spoke, as if measuring her words before committing to them. The shackle was looser. Not physically but in the way it bound us. I wasn't fighting against it anymore. Neither was she. We pressed forward through the wreckage, our steps eerily in sync. Not forced, not dictated by the constraints of the metal, but by something else. Something I couldn't name. Every breath, every twitch of movement, every unspoken thought. It was as if we had crossed some threshold neither of us had been prepared for. She finally broke the silence. That was not an accident. I exhaled sharply, scanning the shadows ahead. No kidding. The attacks are escalating, she continued, her voice low. Whoever is after us is not interested in taking prisoners anymore. I wanted to ask why, but deep down I already knew. The shackle was breaking. That changed things. What happens when it's gone? I asked, forcing myself to keep my tone steady. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than I expected. I don't know. That stopped me in my tracks. Zalarithan never admitted uncertainty. Never. She must have sensed my surprise because she turned, eyes locking onto mine with something dangerously close to frustration. "This bond is forbidden for a reason," she said. "It was meant to be temporary. A lesson." "Not," her jaw clenched as if the words physically pained her. "Not this." I swallowed. "You mean us?" Something flickered across her face, too fast to catch before she turned away. "We need to keep moving." I didn't argue. The tunnels stretched before us, twisting in ways that made no logical sense. The Undercity was built on layers of forgotten ruins, entire districts swallowed and repurposed over centuries. It was the perfect place to hide, or to be hunted. We weren't alone. The first sign was the sound of shifting metal, subtle but deliberate. Not an ambush. A message. Zalarithan reached for her weapon. I felt the motion before she moved, my own muscles tensing in tandem. We were reacting as one. A figure emerged from the shadows. Not an assassin. Not a soldier. An elder. Their robes were adorned with the sigils of the high tribunals, symbols of authority that carried weight beyond any blade. They stepped forward with deliberate precision, their eyes scanning the shackle between us before settling on Zalarithan. "You have gone too far." Her grip tightened on her weapon. "It was never my choice." The elder's expression didn't change. "And yet it is your bond that resists breaking." A heavy silence filled the air. I felt something then, an invisible pressure, a presence curling around us like unseen chains. Not physical but real nonetheless. The elder wasn't here to negotiate. They were here to decide. Zalarithan straightened. "We will not submit." The words sent a jolt through me. We. For the first time since this began, she wasn't just speaking for herself. The elder regarded her for a long moment before shifting their gaze to me. It wasn't a look of anger or disdain but something colder. Calculating. "The bond will break," they said. "One way or another." And then they were gone. No threats. No attack. Just certainty. Zalarithan didn't move for a long time. When she finally did, It was with a sharp inhale, as if shaking off the weight of something unseen. I didn't need to ask what that meant. The shackle was breaking. But so were the rules that governed it. And for the first time I wasn't sure if we were meant to survive it. The silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. Even the distant hum of the Undercity felt muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Solari then stood rigid, her gaze fixed on the empty space where the elder had stood moments ago. There was no sign of them now, no sound of retreating footsteps, no ripple in the shadows. Just absence. She exhaled sharply, a controlled breath that barely concealed her frustration. They will not wait long. I shifted, rolling my shoulders as the weight of our situation pressed in. They didn't attack. She turned to me, eyes sharp. They didn't have to. I understood what she meant. The elder's words weren't a warning. They were a statement of inevitability. The shackle was breaking, and when it did, there would be no more waiting, no more second chances. I glanced down at the metal cuff around my wrist. The once impenetrable alloy now felt unstable. Before, every movement had been dictated by its constraints, every step of forced synchronization. Now there was something different beneath the surface, an imbalance, a shift. What if we leave? I asked. Disappear before they make a move. Solari then's jaw tightened. You don't understand. There is nowhere to go. I frowned. You're saying the entire city is locked down? I'm saying it does not matter how far we run. The bond is not just a physical restraint. It ties us to forces beyond what you comprehend. She hesitated, as if considering how much to tell me. When it was placed upon us, it was not merely a punishment. It was a verdict that sent a chill through me. A verdict for what? Her eyes flickered, something unreadable passing through them. For defying the order of things. I wanted to press further, but the look on her face stopped me. She wasn't just speaking about the tribunal's laws. This was something deeper, something woven into the fabric of their beliefs. A sudden tremor beneath our feet cut the conversation short. The ground shuddered, a deep, reverberating pulse that sent dust cascading from the walls. Solari then reacted instantly, grabbing my wrist and pulling me back against the nearest support beam. Then the world shifted. The tunnel walls flickered just for a second. Like a glitch in reality, the solid structures around us wavered, becoming translucent before snapping back into place. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell was that? Solari then didn't answer. Her grip on my wrist tightened, her posture rigid. But I could see it, she was just as shaken as I was. Then it happened again. This time I felt it inside me. Not just the tremor, but something deeper, a distortion that pulled at my very core. The shackle burned against my skin, a heat that wasn't just physical but something else. Something wrong. I staggered, barely keeping my balance. Solari then cursed under her breath. It's starting. I forced myself upright. What is? She didn't answer right away. Instead she turned, scanning the tunnel ahead as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Finally she spoke. The bond is collapsing. I let that sink in. The thing that had shackled us together, forced our movements into unison, dictated every interaction. We had been fighting against it from the beginning. And now it was unraveling. But why did that feel like a warning instead of a relief? The air around us grew heavier, thick with an energy I couldn't explain. Every breath felt denser, as if I were inhaling something more than just oxygen. My skin prickled, my thoughts felt stretched as if they weren't entirely my own. I looked at Solari then. He was feeling it too. Then the tunnel ahead of us darkened. Not from a lack of light. Something else was swallowing it. Something alive. Solari then grabbed my arm, and this time there was no hesitation. Run. The darkness moved. It wasn't the absence of light. It had weight, substance, a presence that pressed against my skin like something alive. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to fight, to do something, but Solari then had already decided. Her grip tightened around my wrist, and then we were running. The tunnel warped around us. The flickering distortions that had begun moments ago were growing worse, turning the solid walls into something shifting and unstable. Each step sent a jolt through my bones, the air vibrating with an energy that made my thoughts feel sluggish, stretched thin between past and present. Solari then was breathing hard beside me. Not from exertion, she was trained for endurance far beyond mine. No, this was something else. Fear? Frustration? I couldn't tell, but she wasn't stopping. The darkness behind us slithered forward. It wasn't natural. It didn't flow like smoke or mist. It pulled like unseen hands grasping at the edges of reality and dragging themselves closer. "We can't outrun it," I shouted, the words barely audible over the hum in the air. Solari then didn't answer, but she felt my thoughts. The bond between us, fractured, unstable, was still there. A dying ember, flickering with its last moments of connection. For a brief second I wasn't just running beside her. I was inside her thoughts. And what I felt chilled me to my core. She knew what this was. She had always known. The tribunal, the shackle, the punishment. It had never been about control. It had been about containment. Not for her. For me. Something in the collapsing bond surged. A pressure erupted in my chest, forcing me to stumble. Solari then jerked to a stop, catching me before I collapsed completely. The darkness was closing in. And then I heard it. A whisper. It didn't come from ahead or behind. It came from inside me. A voice speaking words I didn't understand, and yet I did. An ancient tongue older than memory, curling through my mind like tendrils of ink in water. Solari then's grip on me was shaking. Not from weakness. From recognition. I turned to her, gasping for breath. "What is happening?" She looked at me then. Truly looked, and for the first time there was no defiance in her eyes. No walls. Only the terrible weight of truth. The bond was never meant to break. Her voice was raw, strained. "Because if it does, you wake up." The whisper in my head grew louder. And the darkness surged forward to claim us both. The darkness swallowed everything. Not just light, not just space. Everything. Sound, breath, thought. For a single terrible moment I wasn't running, wasn't moving, wasn't anything. I existed in a void, weightless, suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Then something snapped. Pain lanced through me like a shockwave, not in my body but in something deeper, something beneath flesh and bone. The shackle on my wrist burned white hot, and a pressure I hadn't even realized was there. Some vast unseen force pressing down on me my entire life, was suddenly gone. The bond had broken. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, lungs dragging in thick, heavy air that felt wrong, tainted. My fingers dug into the ground, if it was even ground anymore, because everything around me had shifted. The tunnel, the ruins, the crumbling walls of the Undercity, gone. I looked up. Nothing made sense. The space around us was moving, vast and infinite, as if we were suspended inside something alive. Not a place, not a structure, but a presence stretching outward in endless, spiraling forms that pulsed with a rhythm I could feel inside my chest. It wasn't the Undercity. It wasn't even the planet. It was somewhere else. Solari then was on her feet, body tense, eyes scanning the shifting void. Her breathing was unsteady, but her hands didn't shake. She had expected this. Feared it. I forced myself up. "Where are we?" She didn't answer. I took a step toward her and the space beneath me rippled. Not solid, not liquid, but something in between. I felt a pull at the edges of my mind, something vast and old curling around the edges of my awareness. The whispering returned. It wasn't words this time. It was something deeper. A memory that wasn't mine. A figure loomed before us. It wasn't made of flesh. It wasn't made of anything. A shape carved from the void itself, shifting in and out of focus, towering, incomprehensible. No eyes, no face, yet I felt its gaze inside me, sifting through every thought, every breath I had ever taken. Solari then moved in front of me, her stance defensive, but I knew, we both knew, there was no fighting this. The entity spoke. Not with words, not with sound, but with the sheer weight of its presence. The truth it carried pressed into me, vast and inescapable. You were never meant to be unshackled. My body locked up. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The thing, whatever it was, wasn't just here. It was everywhere. Zolarithan's voice was barely a whisper. "You don't remember, do you?" I turned to her, heart hammering. "Remember what?" She swallowed, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something raw and human in her expression. "Who you really are." The whispers surged. And the world shattered around me. The world shattered. Not into pieces, not into dust, but into remembrance. Fragments of something vast and ancient poured through me, memories that weren't my own yet had always belonged to me. Time unraveled and I saw a war beyond the limits of history, waged before the first stars cooled. Entities that did not belong to any reality, forces that should never have been allowed to exist. And among them, me. I wasn't human. I wasn't a prisoner. I wasn't even a being. I was a weapon. A force crafted for a single purpose: to end them. The thing before me, the shifting void with no true form, was not my captor. It was my warden. Zalari then had known. That was why she had been shackled to me, why she had never tried to escape despite the tribunal's sentence. She had been my jailer, bound to keep me contained. And now, with the bond broken, with nothing holding me back, I exhaled and the space around us shook. The entity recoiled. It did not feel fear, not in the way lesser beings did, but it recognized what was happening. I could feel it trying to reassert control, trying to press me back into the prison I had unknowingly lived in. But it was too late. The weight that had pressed on me for as long as I could remember was gone. My mind stretched outward, touching the vastness that had been sealed away, and the memories that had been locked within me roared back to life. Zalari then stepped back, hands trembling. "We have to go. Now." I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw her as something more than just a stranger forced into my fate. She had known the truth and still stayed. Had she feared me? Pitied me? It didn't matter. Because I wasn't sure if I was the hero of this story, or the monster they had tried to forget. The void around us screamed, and the battle for my soul began.